picture this dusty Oklahoma in the Depression.
Oh, yeah.
You know, times are tough.
Mm-hmm.
People are desperate.
Yeah.
And that desperation, well, it kind of breeds a different kind of outlaw,
Right.
like the O'Malley gang.
Oh, yeah. I've heard of them.
They're about to pull off this crazy double bank heist,
Okay.
hitting 2 banks at the same time.
At the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like something out of a movie.
Yeah.
But this is real life. And it actually sets the stage for this legal battle that's going to echo through history
I see.
all the way to our conversation today.
Interesting. So, yeah, what's fascinating is how
Okay.
this era, with all its lawlessness and the hardship, it really shines a light on the Second Amendment. It's not just some abstract idea.
Right.
It's playing out right there in the dust.
Yeah.
And the gun smoke.
Of Depression-era Oklahoma.
Exactly.
And at the center of this whole story
Mm-hmm.
is one of those gangsters,
Oh, wow.
Jack Miller,
Oh.
former bouncer who ends up on the wrong side of the law,
Yeah.
gets arrested for having an unregistered sawed-off shotgun.
Oh, wow.
Now, here's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Miller tries to use the Second Amendment as his defense. Seems like a long shot, right?
Yeah.
But his case ends up going all the way to the Supreme Court,
Wow.
and it becomes a landmark case in how we understand gun rights even today.
You see, the Second Amendment,
Yeah.
at its heart, it was a compromise.
Okay.
Born out of a nation that was kind of grappling with this newfound independence.
Right.
You had the Federalists
Uh-huh.
pushing for that strong central government,
Yeah.
and the Anti-Federalists wary of putting too much power in one place.
Right. They needed to find some kind of common ground.
Exactly.
So that's where the Second Amendment comes in.
It guarantees the right to bear arms.
But the language is anything but clear-cut.
Yeah, you're right. It leaves a lot of room for interpretation.
Yeah, like, is it about the right of states to maintain militias?
Like a citizen army.
Right, to balance out the federal power?
Uh-huh.
Or is it about individual rights? The right of any person to own a gun.
That ambiguity.
Yeah.
It's baked right into those 27 words.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
That this one amendment written centuries ago, it's still so relevant
Totally.
and so controversial today.
Yeah. And what's even more fascinating is that the idea of gun control itself,
Right.
restricting access to firearms,
Mm-hmm.
that wasn't a new concept even back then.
So you're saying that gun control's been around for a while?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It's too soon to think about.
In fact, some of the earliest gun regulations,
Uh-huh.
they targeted specific groups
Okay.
based on fear and prejudice.
Wow.
Not unlike some of the arguments that we still hear today.
Oh, really?
There were laws back then restricting gun ownership
Yeah.
by Black Americans,
Mm.
Native Americans,
Okay.
even Catholics.
It's kind of a stark reminder that the history of gun control, it's really intertwined with some of the darker chapters of our past.
Absolutely.
And get this,
Okay.
the concept of regulating where guns can be carried,
Mm-hmm.
that goes back even further.
Further than the founding of the country.
Yeah, we're talking 1328
Wow.
with the Statute of Northampton in England,
Uh-huh.
which restricted carrying arms in certain public places.
That's a great example of
Yeah.
how this debate has these deep historical roots.
Yeah.
Even back then, people were wrestling with this balance between the right to bear arms
Yeah.
and the need for public safety.
Like, think about modern-day restrictions on guns in schools or government buildings.
Right.
It's kind of a continuation of that long-standing tradition.
It is.
So it seems like the idea of absolute
Mm-hmm.
unrestricted gun rights
Yeah.
has never really existed.
Okay.
There's always been some form of regulation,
Yeah.
even from the very beginning.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
So how did we go from these early, often discriminatory regulations to the federal government stepping in with the National Firearms Act of 1934?
Well, the 1920s and 30s,
Yeah.
that was a pretty volatile time.
Right.
Prohibition,
Mm-hmm.
the Great Depression.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of a breeding ground for organized crime.
Wow.
You had gangsters like Al Capone,
Right.
John Dillinger
Mhm.
making headlines.
Yeah.
Public fear was really on the rise.
And then you have
Mhm.
the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929.
Oh, yeah.
7 men lined up and gunned down in broad daylight.
It was a real wake-up call for the nation.
That era with its Tommy guns,
Yeah.
and bootleggers,
Mhm.
it really captured the public imagination
It did.
and pushed the issue of gun violence right to the forefront.
Right to the forefront.
President Roosevelt, with his New Deal for Crime,
Uh-huh.
responded by pushing for federal legislation to control firearms.
Exactly. And that led to the National Firearms Act of 1934, which targeted those types of weapons favored by gangsters, machine guns, sawed-off shotguns, silencers, things that struck fear in the hearts of everyday Americans.
And this is where our bank robber Jack Miller comes back into the picture.
Yeah.
His arrest for that sawed-off shotgun becomes a test case for the Second Amendment.
Right. And the Supreme Court's decision in U.S. v. Miller, that was a pivotal moment.
What did they decide?
The court upheld the NFA. And in their ruling, they really seemed to emphasize the importance of the militia when they were interpreting the Second Amendment. It looked like the collective right to bear arms. The idea of a well-regulated militia that was winning out.
So at this point, it seemed like the focus was on the right to bear arms for collective defense, not individual self-defense.
Yes, but as you know, the story doesn't end there.
Right.
The seeds of a different interpretation, one that was more focused on individual rights. They were already being sown.
We'll have to hear more about that next time.
Yeah. So the 1960s...
They were a turbulent time.
For sure.
The Civil Rights Movement.
Right.
The Vietnam War.
Right.
Just an era of real social and political upheaval and tragically, woven into all of that. Were these high-profile assassinations?
Oh, yeah. It was a devastating decade.
They shook the nation to its core.
Yeah, you're talking about President Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Robert Kennedy.
And it really reignited this whole debate about gun control.
It was a turning point, wasn't it?
It was.
The nation was grappling with so much grief and fear.
Yeah.
There was this renewed sense of urgency to address gun violence.
Absolutely. And that led to the passage of the Gun Control Act of 1968.
This was a big deal, right?
It was huge.
It wasn't just about gangsters and sawed-off shotguns anymore.
No, this time the GCA really broadened the scope of those federal gun regulations. So it banned interstate gun shipments. To make it harder for criminals to get guns across state lines.
Exactly. It also prohibited sales to certain groups. Like minors. Convicted felons.
It was a big step towards trying to keep guns out of the wrong hands.
It was a huge step.
And this is where the NRA really comes into the picture.
Yeah.
I know they started as a group focused on marksmanship and gun safety.
Right.
But their stance on gun control really changed after this, didn't it?
It did, especially after the GCA was passed.
Right.
They became much more vocal in opposing any form of gun regulation, arguing that it infringed on the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens.
And there's that pivotal moment in 1977.
The Cincinnati coup.
Yeah, where the NRA leadership changed.
Yeah.
And they took this much harder line.
Much harder line.
Against gun control.
It was a real turning point for them.
Yeah.
From then on, the NRA became a powerful lobbying force.
Especially at the state level, right?
Especially at the state level.
Yeah. They blocked a lot of efforts to enact stricter gun control measures.
And their influence just grew from there.
So you've got this tension building, a nation struggling with gun violence, this growing movement advocating for stricter controls. But then at the same time, this powerful organization pushing back against those efforts.
It's a recipe for a long and heated debate.
And that's when we start to see this real shift
in
how the Second Amendment is interpreted, moving away from that militia-centric view and toward this focus on individual rights.
Exactly.
So you're talking about the idea that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to own a gun for self-defense.
Self-defense.
Not just for militia service.
Exactly.
And this view gained traction throughout the late 20th century.
It did.
Even among figures like President Reagan.
Yeah, who was an NRA member.
But also supported the Brady Act.
Right. The Brady Act, which mandated those background checks.
Wait, Reagan?
Yeah.
The icon of the conservative movement?
I know, it's surprising, isn't it?
Supporting a gun control measure.
Yeah, it really highlights the complexity of this issue.
For sure.
Even within a single political party. Or a single ideology.
So this individual rights interpretation of the Second Amendment, it was gaining momentum.
It was.
It was starting to resonate across the political spectrum.
Across the board.
So how did this individual rights view become so prominent? Was there a specific event that kind of cemented it?
I think the pivotal moment really came in 2008 with that landmark Supreme Court case.
Which one?
District of Columbia v. Heller.
Okay.
For the first time, this case explicitly recognized an individual's right to own a handgun for self-defense in the home.
This must have been a huge victory for gun rights advocates.
It was a real game changer.
Oh.
But it's important to note that the court didn't declare this right. Absolutely. They acknowledged that it could be subject to regulation.
Oh, so there were still some limits.
Yeah, they left the door open.
Okay.
For certain gun control measures.
Like what?
Like restrictions on felons owning firearms or people with mental health issues.
So it wasn't a complete free-for-all on gun ownership.
No, not at all.
The court recognized the need for some kind of balance.
Right.
And the Heller decision set off this wave of legal challenges across the country.
All over.
Lower courts trying to figure out how to apply this new interpretation of the Second Amendment.
Yeah, it led to a lot of confusion.
I bet.
A lot of conflicting rulings.
It sounds like a legal minefield.
Kind of was.
So what happened next? Did the Supreme Court step back in?
Not right away.
Oh, really?
In fact, they stayed pretty quiet on the issue for over a decade.
Wow.
And that left a lot of uncertainty, inconsistency in how the Second Amendment was being applied.
And then
this new approach emerged, one that would have a huge impact on gun control in America.
So we're in this legal limbo after Heller lower courts, trying to figure out how to apply this new individual rights view of the Second Amendment. What finally brings the Supreme Court back into the picture?
Well, what emerges is this kind of controversial approach to interpreting the Second Amendment. It focuses really heavily on text history and tradition.
Okay, break that down for me. What does that actually mean in practice?
So basically it means that when courts are evaluating a gun law, they're supposed to put more weight on historical context than like modern realities.
Okay.
They have to look back at what kinds of gun regulations were around back in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Okay.
And see if the modern law has some kind of historical analog.
So they're judging today's laws by the standards of a bygone era.
Yeah, basically.
That seems kind of tricky.
It is.
How can you compare a society that used muskets to one with AR-15s?
Yeah, that's one of the main criticisms of this approach. You know, it's been championed by some conservative justices.
Like Justice
Kavanaugh. Even before he was on the Supreme Court.
Mm.
But a lot of legal scholars say...
What do they say?
That it's just way too narrow.
Okay.
And inflexible, you know, to interpret a document that was meant to guide a nation through changing times.
So this text, history, and tradition approach, it becomes the law of the land.
It does. It's codified in a major way by the Supreme Court in 2022 with the case of New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruen.
What happened in that case?
They struck down this New York law that restricted concealed carry permits. And the majority opinion like explicitly laid out this new standard for evaluating gun laws.
Wow. So Bruen really changes the playing field for gun control in America.
It does.
Can you give me a concrete example of how this plays out in a real case?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Just a couple of years later, in 2024, we have the case of United States v. Rahim.
Okay. What was that about?
This case involved a man who was under a domestic violence restraining order.
Okay.
And because of that, he was prohibited from owning a gun.
That seems like a pretty common sense restriction.
Right. You would think so.
Yeah.
But Rahim's lawyers, they argued that this restriction violated his Second Amendment rights.
Really? How?
They said there was no historical analog for prohibiting gun ownership based on a restraining order.
Yeah.
They argued that back in the 18th century, domestic violence wasn't even recognized as a crime.
Wow.
So there couldn't have been a law against it.
That's a disturbing argument.
It is.
It feels like we're letting history dictate our present.
Yeah.
In a way that could put people in danger.
Right.
So what happened in the Rahim case?
Well, the Supreme Court ultimately ruled that restricting gun ownership for people under these domestic violence restraining orders, it didn't violate the Second Amendment.
So they upheld it.
They found that there were enough historical examples of restrictions on people deemed dangerous to justify the modern law.
So in that case, the court didn't strictly adhere to the text, history, and tradition argument?
Right.
It seems like even with this new standard, there's still room for interpretation and debate.
Absolutely. The debate over the Second Amendment is far from settled.
For sure.
These recent cases like Heller and Bruen,
yeah,
they've reshaped the legal landscape, but they've also raised new questions and sparked even more debate.
Well, it's incredible how this one amendment, written over 200 years ago,
I know, it's amazing,
continues to be such a powerful force in American society.
It's a testament to how relevant it still is.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to the complexity of this issue.
What's most important is that we keep having these conversations,
Yeah.
that we understand the history, the legal arguments,
Yeah.
and that we approach this issue with thoughtfulness and respect.
Respect for all viewpoints.
Exactly.
You've given us a lot to think about. So for our listeners out there,
Yeah.
what's the one key takeaway you want them to leave with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the Second Amendment is a living document. It's constantly being interpreted and reinterpreted.
Right.
And it's a reminder that our rights come with responsibilities.
That's a good point.
And finding that balance,
yeah,
that's an ongoing process.
It is.
It's a conversation that we have to keep having.
Beautifully said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the history of the Second Amendment and gun control.
It was my pleasure.
We hope it sparked some thought-provoking conversations for you. And if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more explorations of complex and fascinating topics.